This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
My name no longer matters. Like thousands of other men who climbed these mountains with hope in their eyes and weapons in their hands, my identity dissolves into the mists of the Dinaric Alps. It was 1941 when I heard the whispers in occupied villages, when Tito called the sons of Yugoslavia to a resistance that no one believed was possible. The Nazis had already divided our country among their allies, spreading death and enslavement to every corner of our lands. But on that mountain, among stones worn by time and trees that witnessed generations, we found something tanks could not crush: the flame of freedom. I was just another body then, another rifle, another voice in the darkness. But I was there, and I was willing to die for something greater than myself. I remember my commander's face when he first met us, a man whose eyes carried the weight of a vision that transcended mere warfare. He never promised easy victory, never deceived us. He simply said, "We must fight." That death was certain for many, but slavery was more terrible than any bullet. That night, beside a fire whose smoke tried to hide us, I realized I was no longer just a laborer or a son or a brother. I had become a partisan, a ghost in the mountains, a soldier without a uniform and without recognition. We were the invisible army, the people's resistance, and we would either liberate our nation or perish trying. There was no middle ground, no surrender in our hearts. The mountains became our fortress, our sanctuary, and our grave. We carved paths through snow and stone, built shelters in caves where our ancestors had once hidden from Ottoman invaders. History repeated itself, but this time we would not bow. The Austrian and German soldiers hunted us relentlessly, but they were strangers to these peaks, invaders in a land they could never truly understand. We knew every ravine, every hidden path, every place where an enemy soldier would stumble in the darkness. The advantage was ours, yet it felt like nothing against their overwhelming numbers and firepower. Still, we pressed on, driven by something primal and undeniable, a need to reclaim what was ours. We trained in the snow and rain, sharpening our skills with each passing day. Our weapons were a mixture of captured Nazi rifles, old hunting guns, and whatever we could salvage from fallen soldiers. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent, and winter threatened to kill as many of us as German bullets. Yet men kept coming, joining our ranks, understanding that resistance was not a choice but a moral imperative. Officers emerged from among us, men who had been farmers and teachers, now transformed into military strategists by necessity and determination. The hierarchy mattered little. What mattered was our unified purpose, our collective will to transform these mountains into a graveyard for fascism. As weeks turned into months, I began to understand what Tito had envisioned. This was not just about military tactics or territorial gains. This was about the soul of Yugoslavia, about proving that ordinary people could stand against the machinery of totalitarian war. We were workers and intellectuals, Muslims and Orthodox Christians, Serbs and Croats, all united under one banner. The ethnic divisions that would later tear our nation apart seemed irrelevant then, melted away by the heat of our common struggle. In those mountains, we were brothers bound by blood and conviction, separated only by the night that concealed us. I had never felt more human, more purposeful, even as death stalked us with every breath we took. The propaganda machines of Berlin called us terrorists, criminals, bandits, unworthy of soldiers' honor. Their broadcasts crackled through hidden radios, attempting to delegitimize our struggle, to poison the minds of civilians against us. But the people knew the truth. When we moved through villages at night, they left food and information, risking everything to support our cause. Mothers hid our wounded in their homes. Fathers fabricated alibis for their sons who had joined us. Entire communities became part of the resistance. We were not separate from the population. We were the population armed with conviction. The Nazis could not comprehend this symbiosis, this fusion of military and civilian resistance that made us impossible to defeat completely. I remember a particular night when we intercepted a German supply convoy. The operation was flawless, a testament to months of planning and coordination. We struck like phantoms, emerged from the darkness, took what we needed, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. That night, we celebrated quietly, knowing that we had hurt the enemy, that our resistance was not symbolic, but real and consequential. Yet this victory came at a cost. 2 of our men fell, young faces I had learned to know over weeks of shared suffering. We buried them under cover of darkness, speaking prayers in whispered voices, and I felt the weight of command for the first time. Understanding that every life we lost was a piece of our nation's future being stolen by war. The enemy adapted to our tactics, becoming more ruthless and desperate. They implemented scorched earth policies, burning villages suspected of harboring partisans, executing entire families to break our spirits. The atrocities multiplied, each one a torch added to the fire of our determination. I witnessed horrors that no human should witness, saw the depths of human cruelty when ideology replaces conscience. A grandmother was hanged from a tree in a village where we had sought refuge. Her crime was offering us bread. An entire monastery was burned with monks inside because priests had blessed our weapons. These images became seared into my consciousness, driving me forward even when exhaustion threatened to consume me. They wanted us to break, to retreat, to surrender. Instead, we became harder, colder, more irresolute. Our partisan bands grew larger, more organized, more formidable. What had begun as desperate resistance became a genuine military force, capable of engaging German troops in direct combat. We liberated territory, established provisional governments, demonstrated that an alternative was possible beyond Nazi occupation. The world began to take notice. Understanding that Yugoslavia was not passively accepting defeat, but actively fighting for its future. This recognition changed something fundamental in our psychology. We were no longer merely rebels fighting in mountains. We were soldiers of a legitimate struggle, warriors for a cause that transcended our individual lives. The weight of this responsibility settled on my shoulders like winter snow, beautiful and suffocating simultaneously. But victory was far from assured. The enemy still vastly outnumbered us, still possessed superior weapons and resources. We suffered terrible defeats, watched as entire units were surrounded and decimated, retreated from territories we had liberated only weeks before. I lost friends whose names I had learned to speak and laugh with around campfires. I watched men I had trained alongside fall to German machine gun fire, their screams echoing through valleys that seemed too beautiful to contain such violence. Each loss hollowed something inside me. Each defeat threatened to shatter my resolve. Yet somehow we persisted, regrouped, and fought again. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. This was the grinding, unglamorous persistence of those who refused to accept annihilation. The geography of our war expanded constantly. We controlled liberated territories, established schools and hospitals, functioned as a proto-government in exile. Women joined our ranks, initially as nurses and messengers, gradually as combat fighters. I trained alongside a woman named Marij, a partisan who could handle a rifle better than half the men I knew, whose determination burned as fiercely as any of ours. The revolution within the revolution, they called it this transformation of traditional gender roles under the pressure of existential struggle. These women were not symbols or propaganda. They were essential to our survival, equally capable of sacrifice, and equally worthy of respect. In those mountains, we glimpsed briefly what society could become when necessity forced us to abandon prejudice. 3 years into our resistance, I barely recognized the man I had become. My face was weathered beyond its years, marked by sun, exposure, and malnutrition, lined with experiences that should have required a lifetime to accumulate. Scars decorated my body like maps of battles survived, reminders of close encounters with death. A piece of shrapnel still lodged near my spine, a souvenir from a bombing run that had killed 6 men in my unit. I carried this foreign object in my flesh, a constant reminder of my vulnerability, my mortality, my luck in a game where millions had lost. The soldier I was in 1941, filled with idealistic fervor, seemed like a stranger, someone from another life entirely. The toll on our collective psyche was immeasurable. Men who had been jovial and talkative became silent, processing trauma through withdrawal rather than conversation. Others developed obsessive behaviors, compulsively checking weapons or obsessing about supply lines, their minds fractured by stress. Some went mad in the clinical sense, wandering off into the mountains, speaking to ghosts only they could see. We did our best to support one another, but we lacked the language and tools to truly address what we were experiencing. Psychiatry seemed like a luxury of peacetime, and we were creatures of perpetual war now. Our humanity was being reshaping by violence and loss. Our emotional landscape transformed into something harder and less certain. Yet amidst this darkness, moments of profound humanity emerged. I remember sharing a can of food with an enemy soldier we had captured, a young German barely old enough to grow a beard. He wept as he told us about his family in Hamburg, about how he had been conscripted against his will, how he too was trapped in a war that no reasonable person wanted. We held him. This enemy offered him kindness that his own side would never offer us if situations were reversed. He died from infection 3 days later, and we buried him with the same respect we afforded our own fallen. This paradox defined our existence. We were killers and mercenaries when necessity demanded it, yet capable of compassion and recognition of shared humanity even in moments of war. The international brigades brought foreigners to our cause, men and women from across Europe and beyond, who believed in the righteousness of our struggle against fascism. They brought equipment and expertise, connections to larger strategic considerations beyond our immediate survival. Through their presence, we understood that our fight was part of something global, that the fate of Yugoslavia was entangled with the fates of nations across the continent. This expanded perspective was both empowering and terrifying. We were not isolated mountain fighters anymore. We were part of a worldwide conflict with stakes that threatened the very foundation of human civilization. This knowledge motivated us even as it increased the pressure on our shoulders. By 1944, the tide was turning. Soviet forces advanced from the east. German positions weakened across Eastern Europe, and the Nazi regime began its death throes. Our partisans controlled significant territories and commanded respect even from international observers. Tito's name was spoken in the same conversations as Stalin and other powerful leaders, and Yugoslavia's future seemed increasingly secure under partisan control. Yet this very success created new tensions and complications. If we survived the war, what would come next? How would we prevent our multi-ethnic coalition from fragmenting once the common enemy was defeated? These questions haunted our leadership, though many of us lower-ranking soldiers were too exhausted to contemplate such futures. We focused on the present moment, on the next battle, the next supply run, the next day of survival. The reality of our victories began to crystallize into something almost surreal. Villages that had been under occupation for years were liberated, their citizens emerging from hiding to greet us with tears and flowers. We became symbols of hope, proof that resistance was possible, tangible evidence that the Nazi machine was not invincible. Yet we knew these celebrations were premature, that much hard fighting remained ahead. We were also acutely aware that our military victories would soon yield to political complexities. Some among our leadership harbored ambitions beyond liberation, dreams of permanent social transformation that would reshape Yugoslav society according to communist ideals. Others simply wanted to restore the nation to something resembling its pre-war state. These divergent visions, previously subordinated to military necessity, began surfacing more prominently. By early 1945, we could smell victory on the wind, taste it in water sources freed from German control, see it in the expanded territories. Now, under partisan administration, yet this approaching triumph filled me with an unexpected emptiness. For years, my life had possessed a singular clarity of purpose. Everything I did, every risk I took, every loss I endured served a concrete objective: drive out the occupiers, reclaim our nation. This framework had been brutally simple but emotionally satisfying. It provided meaning in the midst of chaos, purpose in the face of meaninglessness. Now, as that objective approached completion, I faced a void. What would happen when there was no war to fight? Who would I become when survival ceased to be my primary function? I was no longer a civilian, could never truly return to the person I had been before 1941. The mountains had branded me, reshaped my character in fundamental ways. I had killed men, ordered others to their probable deaths, made decisions that haunted me in quiet moments. I had also experienced camaraderie so profound it transcended normal human bonding, had witnessed courage and sacrifice that permanently elevated my conception of human potential. These contradictions could not be resolved or synthesized if I carried both capacities simultaneously: the capacity for violence and the capacity for tenderness, the ability to cause suffering and the ability to alleviate it. War had not unified these contradictions. It had simply forced me to live with them both. The final months of our struggle against Nazi occupation were simultaneously the most intense and the most confusing. We fought with renewed vigor, understanding that every day brought us closer to liberation. Yet we also fought knowing that something we cherished would be lost in victory: the essential unity that had held our diverse partisan movement together. The sense that all of us were united against a clear enemy would fracture once the Germans were vanquished. Yugoslav communists would inevitably move toward authoritarian control, suppressing the democratic elements within our movement. Nationalists would resist this domination, and the ethnic tensions that had been sublimated during our common struggle would resurface. We had glimpsed an alternative possibility in those mountains, a moment when humanity could transcend its normal divisions. That moment was temporary, as all such moments inevitably are. I often thought about the names I had been too late to save, the communities destroyed before we could liberate them, the lives irreversibly altered by war's passage through our lands. Yugoslavia had paid a terrible price for its resistance and its autonomy. Approximately 1 million of our people had died, roughly 1/10 of our entire population. For context, this percentage exceeded even the Soviet Union's catastrophic losses, making Yugoslavia one of the most devastated nations in Europe. Entire families had been extinguished, communities erased, cultural treasures destroyed. We had won our independence and prevented our nation from becoming a German puppet state, but the costs had been almost unbearable. In quiet moments, I questioned whether our sacrifices had been worth these human expenditures, whether any political goal could justify such enormous suffering. As German forces crumbled and retreated northward, I experienced a strange mixture of emotions that I struggled to articulate even to my closest comrades. There was triumph, certainly, the satisfaction of seeing the enemy defeated, of witnessing the fruits of our persistent resistance. But there was also sorrow, mourning for what we had lost in achieving this victory. The innocent civilians murdered, the soldiers fallen in their prime, the years stolen from all of us who had aged a lifetime in the mountain shadows. There was also uncertainty about the future, feared that our political leaders would betray the sacrifices we had made by establishing an authoritarian regime that would merely replace Nazi tyranny with communist oppression. These emotions warred within me, creating a psychological tension that I could not fully resolve. The approaching peace felt almost more threatening than the war had been. War provided structure, clarity, and purpose. It answered the fundamental question of what one should be doing each day. But peace required us to rebuild, to heal, to reintegrate into society after years of living outside normal social frameworks. How would men like me, transformed by violence and suffering, fit back into civilian existence? Would we be celebrated as heroes or forgotten as inconvenient reminders of a terrible era? Would our sacrifices be honored or eventually dismissed as the inevitable cost of historical progress? These questions occupied my mind as we approached the final liberation of our territory, as the reality of victory became impossible to deny. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the absence of noise was somehow more deafening than the constant thunder of warfare had been. No more distant explosions, no more the crack of gunfire in the darkness, no more the groaning of men in pain around campfires. The silence should have been peaceful, but instead it felt like standing in a tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of millions who would never hear another bird sing. We emerged from the mountains into a nation that was technically liberated but psychologically devastated, physically destroyed but spiritually transformed. Our victory was complete, yet it felt profoundly incomplete, as though we had merely postponed rather than resolved the fundamental conflicts that had spawned this catastrophic war. I was given medals and commendations, citations praising my bravery and service to the nation. These honors meant very little to me, felt hollow and insufficient as markers of what we had actually endured. The real compensation would have been the lives of those comrades who did not survive to see this moment, the communities that remained destroyed regardless of military victory, the centuries of development lost to 4 years of total warfare. But those compensations were not available, could never be provided by any government or authority. We simply had to accept the inadequacy of gratitude, the insufficiency of recognition, the fact that no reward or honor could truly equalize the ledger of what had been given and what had been taken. Yugoslavia's new government moved quickly to consolidate power, establishing a socialist federal republic under Tito's leadership. Some aspects of what he accomplished were genuinely progressive. Land reform, women's equality, ethnic unity promoted through communist ideology, but inevitably, authoritarian controls became more pronounced. Dissent was suppressed, and the revolutionary ideals that had animated our mountain resistance were channeled into rigid party structure and centralized authority. Many of us felt a betrayal, understanding that we had fought partly to replace one tyranny with another, albeit one that claimed to serve the people's interests rather than a racially selected master race. This knowledge was bitter, a particular kind of disappointment that follows revolutionary struggles throughout history. Yet I cannot say that our resistance was meaningless, that our sacrifices were wasted. We had prevented Yugoslavia from becoming part of the greater Germanic Reich, from having its peoples enslaved or exterminated according to Nazi racial ideology. Our actions preserved our nation's independence and our people's ability to determine their own fate. However imperfectly, that fate was subsequently managed. We had also created a powerful precedent, demonstrating that ordinary people could resist overwhelming military power through organization, determination, and willingness to sacrifice everything. Future generations might learn from our example, understanding that resistance to oppression is always possible, even when the odds seem impossible. The memories of those mountain years never truly fade. Even decades later, they resurfaced in moments of solitude, triggered by sudden sounds or unexpected vistas that remind me of our old positions and shelters. I sometimes encounter old comrades, and we exchange glances of recognition that require no words. We knew each other in ways that only those who have faced death together can know one another. We shared a psychological space that civilians can never fully access, a place where human limitations were tested to their absolute maximum. This bond was forged in blood and maintained through shared loss, and it persists even as the decades place increasing distance between that terrible period and our current lives. I think often about the youngness of so many who died, boys barely past adolescence, who had to instantly become men of war. I think about the women who proved themselves equal to every challenge, who demonstrated that courage and capability know no gender. I think about the Ottoman, the priest, the factory worker, the teacher, the merchant, all unified under one banner, all willing to sacrifice everything for their nation's freedom. This diversity of our movement, this multi-ethnic coalition that briefly transcended ancient prejudice, was perhaps our greatest achievement. In those mountains, we glimpsed what human society could become if we prioritized our shared humanity over our ethnic, religious, or ideological divisions. That vision remained unrealized in practice, but it burned brightly for those few years, enough to light the path for future generations who might choose differently. Now, in my advancing years, I am simply another old man walking through a city rebuilt from ashes, living in a nation that has moved far beyond the war years. The world barely remembers us, these anonymous partisans who sacrificed our youth in mountains that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. Historians write about our military campaigns with clinical precision, analyzing tactical decisions and strategic outcomes, but they cannot capture the essence of what we experienced, the depths of human resilience and frailty that were tested in those years. We were not professional soldiers, but ordinary people, transformed into warriors by extraordinary circumstances. We possessed no special qualifications beyond a willingness to resist and end belief that some things were worth dying for. The questions that plagued me during those final months of war remain unanswered. Whether our sacrifices truly accomplished what we intended, whether the costs were justified by the benefits, whether history ultimately vindicated our choices or revealed them as tragic miscalculations. I have learned to live with these uncertainties, understanding that history rarely provides the clarity we desperately seek. We did what we thought was right with the information and moral frameworks available to us. That is all any generation can do. That is the human condition throughout history. Acting in the present with incomplete knowledge, hoping that future generations will judge our choices with wisdom and compassion. What I know with absolute certainty is that we were changed forever by those years in the mountains. The man who emerged from that struggle was not the same person who had climbed those peaks as a young, idealistic partisan. War had taken something from us that can never be returned. a certain innocence about human nature and our capacity for civilization, but it had also added something, a permanent sense of human dignity and capability that persists even through the darkest moments of despair. We had looked death in the face and refused to blink, had endured suffering that should have broken us, and persisted despite everything pushing us toward surrender. This knowledge, this internal certainty of our own strength, became a foundation upon which everything else was built. For those still living, for those comrades who survived alongside me, there is a bittersweet recognition that we are now the guardians of history. Our testimony is among the few authentic records of what truly happened in those mountains, how it felt to resist tyranny against impossible odds, what ordinary human beings can accomplish when united by conviction. This responsibility weighs heavily. Future generations deserve to know that resistance was possible, that people like themselves managed extraordinary things under terrible circumstances, that passivity in the face of injustice is always a choice and never inevitable. By sharing our story, I honor those who did not survive, those whose names have been forgotten by the world but whose actions shaped the course of nations. I have no regrets about those years. Though I carry their weight throughout my life, I do not glorify war or suffering, would not wish those experiences on anyone. But I cannot deny that those years in the mountains gave my life meaning and purpose that I might never have discovered otherwise. I learned what I was capable of enduring, what principles were worth sacrifice, how profound human connection could become when forged through shared danger and common cause. The partisan movement did not achieve all it set out to accomplish, but it achieved enough. We defended our nation, preserved our independence, and proved that ordinary people could stand against overwhelming power and influence the course of history through their actions. In the end, perhaps that is all any generation can hope to achieve. The mountains still stand where we fought them, ancient and indifferent to the struggles of human beings who briefly marred their surfaces. Sometimes I return to those peaks, hoping to reconnect with something of that time, to feel the presence of those who did not leave. The forests have regrown, the shelters we built have crumbled back into the earth. The scars of warfare have largely healed in the landscape, but the emotional geography remains unchanged. Every path echoing with the footsteps of ghosts, every ravine holding the weight of our collective sacrifice. I walk slowly through this terrain of memory, understanding that this is where I truly became myself, where all the potential I carried as a young man was finally expressed and forged into something permanent. The Yugoslav state that we fought to preserve has since fragmented, torn apart by the same ethnic tensions that we had briefly transcended in our common struggle against fascism. The tragic wars of the 1990s would tear Yugoslavia apart, creating new nations from the ashes of our carefully constructed unity. Perhaps this was inevitable, the natural consequence of trying to force diverse peoples into artificial political structures. Or perhaps our failures of political leadership in the post-war period created the conditions for this fragmentation. Either way, the irony is profound. We sacrificed so much to preserve Yugoslav independence, only to see it destroyed by internal conflict. Mere decades later, this knowledge is painful, a particular kind of defeat that cuts deeper than military losses ever could. Yet I refuse to let this outcome negate the meaningfulness of our struggle during the war years. We did what was right and necessary in our historical moment. We resisted genocide, prevented the extinction of our peoples, preserved the possibility that we might determine our own future as autonomous nations. That future has been complicated and tragic in ways we could not have predicted, but it remained our future, shaped by our choices rather than imposed by foreign conquerors. This distinction matters, even if the subsequent history has been painful. We fought for the right to make our own mistakes, rather than have mistakes imposed upon us by occupiers. That remains a victory worth defending, even in retrospect. For young people today, growing up in a region still recovering from recent wars, I offer this testimony. Tyranny always presents itself as inevitable, as the natural order of things that no one can resist. This is the greatest lie that oppression tells. We proved that resistance is always possible, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they possess sufficient conviction and willingness to sacrifice. Your generation inherits a world that is still marked by our choices and conflicts, still shaped by the echoes of our struggles. Learn from our successes and our failures. Understand that your actions today shape the world that future generations will inherit. Never accept the narrative that powerlessness is inevitable, that resistance is impossible, that individual actions cannot matter. We are proof that these narratives are lies. The partisan movement produced more than military victories. It created a template for how peoples could organize themselves to resist unjust power. This legacy extends far beyond Yugoslavia, inspiring resistance movements throughout the world who drew courage from our example. In this sense, our sacrifice was not confined to our nation, but contributed to broader struggles for human freedom and dignity wherever they have occurred. The world knows relatively little about us compared to the famous military figures of the Second World War. Yet our impact was profound and lasting. We demonstrated that the outcome of war is never predetermined, that even the most powerful empires can be resisted by determined people operating from conviction rather than military superiority. As I approach the end of my years, I am struck by how little attention history pays to millions of ordinary soldiers like myself. We were not generals or politicians, not the famous names that appear in history books and documentaries. We were the ground-level warriors, the ones who actually implemented the visions of our leaders, who paid in blood and suffering for every meter of liberation we achieved. Our names are forgotten, our individual stories lost to time, yet our collective impact was immense. This anonymity is perhaps fitting. We did not fight for a recognition or glory. We fought because circumstances demanded it and our conscience compelled it. The work of resistance is often anonymous, performed by ordinary people who never expect their names to echo through history. Standing here now, watching younger generations build their lives in the peace that we secured through sacrifice, I feel a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. Pride in what we accomplished, in the courage we demonstrated, in the unity we briefly achieved across ethnic and religious lines. Melancholy for what was lost, for the lives that were never lived, for the possibilities that were destroyed along with our cities and infrastructure. If I could speak to that young man who first climbed into the mountains in 1941, I would not tell him it would be worth it because the price was too high to justify in pure mathematical terms. But I would tell him that it mattered, that his actions contributed to something significant, that his choice to resist rather than accept enslavement was the right choice, even if it led to suffering that should never have been necessary. I leave this testimony for future generations not as a celebration of war or a glorification of violence, but as a record of what ordinary human beings can accomplish when they are united by conviction and willing to sacrifice everything. This testimony is for those who will face oppression in whatever form it takes in their future. Time for those who will need to remember that resistance is always possible, that the powerful are never as invincible as they appear. This testimony is for the historians who must accurately record what happened in our mountains, for the scholars who will analyze our choices and our consequences, for the citizens of future nations who will inherit the world we helped create through our actions. I am simply one of millions who fought in the Second World War, one of thousands who served in the Yugoslav Partisan movement, one of hundreds in my specific unit whose name was never recorded officially. Yet I am also a witness to history, a repository of experiences that illuminate what human beings can endure and accomplish under extreme circumstances. I have tried to communicate that experience truthfully, without romanticizing the violence or hiding the costs. We were not heroes in the traditional sense, not figures worthy of statues and grand monuments. We were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because the moment demanded it and our hearts compelled it. To all those who may read this testimony years after I have passed from this world, I make this simple request. Remember that peace is not inevitable, that freedom must be actively defended and renewed with each generation, that ordinary people possess far greater power than they typically assume. Remember those who fell in these mountains, whose names were never recorded in any official history, whose sacrifices were made without expectation of recognition. Remember that resistance to oppression is always morally justified, that there are things worth dying for, that human dignity must sometimes be defended with weapons when all peaceful alternatives have been exhausted. Remember that unity across ethnic, religious, and ideological lines is possible when people prioritize their shared humanity over their differences. This is the legacy we leave to you, the gift of our experience purchased at an almost unbearable cost. The mountains still stand where we fought them, and perhaps on quiet evenings, when the light fades to shadow and the wind moves through the peaks, you might sense our presence there, not as ghosts seeking vengeance or demanding recognition, but simply as echoes of the struggle that shaped your world. We were the partisan fighters who refused to accept tyranny, who chose resistance over submission, who proved that freedom is worth defending with our lives if necessary. This is all I can offer. The truth of our experience, the reality of what we endured, the knowledge that ordinary people like you and me, given sufficient conviction, can stand against the machinery of fascism and win. We were anonymous soldiers in the mountains of Yugoslavia, and our names have largely been forgotten by history, but our actions changed the course of a nation, preserved the possibility of freedom for millions of people, and demonstrated that resistance is always possible in the face of oppression. This is how I choose to be remembered, not as an individual hero, but as part of a collective struggle, a nameless partisan among thousands who believed that some things were worth dying for. When history remembers Isif, it chooses to remember us at WWII. Hope it will record not just our military campaigns and tactical victories, but the fundamental human drama of ordinary people refusing to accept the world as powerful forces attempted to impose it. We failed in some ways and succeeded in others, but we never stopped trying, never surrendered our conviction that liberation was worth any sacrifice. This is the testimony of a soldier without a name, speaking across the decades. To those who will inherit the world we fought to preserve, listen carefully, because the lessons of our struggle are written in the mountains themselves, carved into the very peaks that bore witness to our resistance. The fascist night may have passed, but the forces that spawned it still lurk in the shadows of human society. Vigilance, courage, and unwavering commitment to human dignity remain essential for every generation. We passed the torch to you. The choice of whether to carry it forward belongs to you and your children and all the generations yet to come.